Thank you for joining us for the Greater Houston Partnership's 2020 State of Houston's Global Economy virtual event. Please welcome the President and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership, Bob Harvey.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Harvey, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership. Welcome to our 6th annual State of Houston's Global Economy event. What a difference a year makes. After our 2019 Global Economy event, I asked our team what we might do differently for the 2020 installment to shake things up a bit, and we developed some really interesting plans. Of course, none of us could have anticipated where we are today and the need to present this important information, not in person in a ballroom, as would typically be our custom, but virtually. I always look forward to this event as an opportunity to discuss the ever-expanding role trade and international business play in the Houston economy. We have long been a major international gateway, and the trajectory of trade volume out of our port, from our airports, and other metrics have continued to climb in recent years, despite trade wars and other geopolitical turmoil. In fact, over the last decade, Houston has come to increasingly rely on the growth of the global economy for our own success. But the arrival of the coronavirus and the collapse of the oil markets have put that growth on hold, and we are carefully watching the impact on Houston's business ties to the rest of the globe. Our speakers today, former U.S. Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez and the partnership's own Senior Vice President of Research, Patrick Jankowski, will offer their perspectives on what these volatile challenges will mean for Houston's economic future. While the coronavirus has had a major impact on global supply chains and trade, which adversely impacts international cities such as Houston, there should be no doubt that Houston's place as a global city remains a good thing for all of us who call Houston home. Our identity as the most culturally and ethnically diverse city in the nation, an open and welcoming place where people from around the world come to thrive, will not be undermined by this pandemic. In fact, the way Houston's political and civic leadership, its employers and employees, and the public at large have responded to the request to stay home and socially distance and operate business safely has placed Houston near the top of the list of major U.S. cities that, so far, have kept the virus reasonably in check. Our city's indomitable spirit has perhaps never been more fully on display. Houston will continue to be one of the world's great cities and hopefully an example for others of how to recover and rebuild a stronger and more resilient economy. We appreciate each of you joining us today and encourage you to follow along with our conversation on social media using hashtag GlobalHOU. Now, before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsor of today's event, Mitsubishi Corporation Americas. To the entire team at Mitsubishi, we greatly appreciate your support of the partnership. I would also like to thank the partnership's signature sponsors who provide annual support for our events, business resource groups, and councils. And our production partner, Vision, for their work to make this afternoon's event possible. In addition to their generous support, I would like to acknowledge the partnership's 1,100 member companies for their investment in the partnership's mission, without whom none of our work would be possible. And finally, I would like to recognize our elected officials and consular corps for their service to the region. In just a bit, we'll have a question and answer session with former U.S. Commerce Secretary and current chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, Carlos Gutierrez, who will share his thoughts on the impact of the coronavirus on the global economy, as well as specific areas such as U.S.-China trade relations, USMCA, and more. But first, I'm pleased to introduce Patrick Jankowski to give us his perspective on Houston's ties to the global economy. Patrick is the partnership's senior regional economist and leads our research team, which continuously monitors the global forces affecting Houston. Patrick's observations and analysis on the local, regional, and U.S. economic trends have appeared in more than 200 newspapers, magazines, and radio and television broadcasts, both here in the U.S. and abroad. Patrick has worked for the Greater Houston Partnership and his predecessor, the Greater Houston Chamber of Commerce, for more than 37 years. He's a graduate of UT Austin with a degree in economics. Patrick, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for our Global Houston event here in May 2020. I hope to share some insights to you as what we see going on in the global economy and how it's going to affect Houston, and how it'll affect you, your businesses, your families, your employees. So let's go ahead and get started. Headline, BBC, coronavirus, the world faces the worst recession since the Great Depression. So what does that mean? Well, there's a study out there done by the Asian Development Bank. They're looking at global GDP actually shrinking by about 9.7% this year. It's $8.8 trillion. Yes, it's $8.8 trillion with the T. Give you some idea of what that's like. And if you think about that, the $8.8 trillion, that's like the combined output of India, France, and Brazil. So that $8.8 trillion is as if all that output went away. The UN has a study out there about the number of jobs at risk. We hear about the jobs that are being lost in Houston and Texas and the US all the time, not necessarily hearing about what's happening on globally, but this will give you some insight. They're saying that job loss is about half of the world's workforce. That's a little bit of an overstatement. That would be about 1.4 billion jobs. I really don't think it's going to be that high, but if you look at what the Asian Development Bank is saying, the 158 million to 224, that's probably more in the realm of possibility. So if you want to get some idea of what that 158 to 224 looks like, on the low end, that would be like losing every job in the United States. On the high end, that'd be like losing every job in the US and every job in Japan. The downturn, the COVID recession that we're seeing, it's affecting not just GDPs, not just people's jobs, it's affecting government's ability to function. That's when the IMF steps in. It gives you some idea of just how bad this downturn is. There have been 100 countries have gone to the IMF and said, please, can you lend us some money? That's about half of all the countries in the world, and so far 55 of those requests have been approved. So let's ratchet over to the U.S. What do we see in the U.S.? U.S. GDP slumped 4.8% in the first quarter, ending the longest economic expansion on record. This is an expansion that went back all the way back to 2010. Kind of get some idea what that looks like. You could see we're going on a pretty steady clip there. We were growing at about 2% or better for the last, actually for the last 10 years. And then we had this drop off in the first quarter of 4.8%. It's interesting, if you think about it, a quarter, that's what, 13 weeks? We really didn't start shutting down the economy until the last 2 weeks of March, actually the last 2 weeks of the quarter. And that was enough to drag down GDP by almost 5%. Well, things are going to be kind of rough this quarter. The second quarter we're in actually going to be much worse. And you can see Wall Street Journal has been publishing that the economy may shrink by nearly a third this quarter. And that would look something like this, kind of put it in perspective. You can see just how bad off the U.S. economy is, how much struggle there is going to be here in the U.S. So let's talk about jobless claims. They keep climbing. They're not slowing down at the rate we wish they were slowing down. There are almost 40 million claims have been filed since the lockdown began. Give you some idea, you can see it right there, how they just suddenly started to shoot up mid to late March. Looks like they peaked in late March, early April, but they're still at a fairly high elevated rate. That 2.4 million claims that you see on the screen on the far right-hand side, that's over 10 times what we were seeing at the beginning of March. So what about Houston? We are in Houston. This is a Houston organization. This is a presentation primarily to people in Houston, but actually people all over the world to get some idea of what's happening in Houston. And the data points out there, they don't look real good for Houston. And that's not surprising, since so much of Houston's growth or so much of Houston's prosperity, it depends upon what's going on globally. If you want to look at job losses, data was just released on Friday. We finally have some idea of the extent of the job losses in March and in April. That's 330,000 people have lost their job in the 9-county metropolitan area since mid-March. That actually now exceeds the total number of job losses that we had during the Great Recession, which was about 110,000. It's actually more than what we had during the energy bust of the 80s. Energy bust of the 80s, we lost 221,000, but the economy was a lot smaller then. And so what we're looking at right now, this job loss is at 330,000. That's about 1 in every 10 Houstonians having lost their job. Back in the 80s energy bust, it was more like 1 in 7. So we're not quite there, but we are going to get there because we've had 425,000 claims filed for unemployment benefits. And the job numbers and the unemployment benefits numbers, they overlap, but they don't align. And this is telling me that there's probably another 100,000 jobs that could be lost out there when the numbers finally show up. So we're easily looking at, before we start to see improvement in Houston's economy, of a loss of probably 400,000 jobs, if not more. And then there's the unemployment rate, the 14.2% unemployment rate. That is the highest unemployment rate on record for Houston. The worst unemployment rate was in June of 1986. We got up to 12.9%. And as bad as this 14.2% is, I have to tell you, the rate is really worse than that. Because the unemployment rate, it's a simple ratio. You look at the number of people who are unemployed and you divide them by the number of people in the workforce. Well, last month, the workforce shrunk. It shrunk by about 250,000 people. Basically what it means are 250,000 more people who are unemployed who are simply not looking for work. You add those who've dropped out of the workforce in March and April, and you're looking at adding that to the unemployment rate, you're probably going to see an unemployment rate of close to 20%, a real unemployment rate if that was added back in. Which means when we do get the May numbers, when we get them in June, we're going to see a much higher unemployment rate than we're seeing now. So this is a Houston Purchasing Managers Index, PMI. Those of you who've seen me present before, I'm sure you're familiar with this. I am so glad I don't have to pay royalties on this slide because I use it all the time. If I did pay royalties on it, the PMI people would have a lot of money out of my pocket. But this is an indicator of just general production in the region, general economic growth. It's a survey where they talk to the purchasing managers each month, ask them a series of questions about orders, about employment, about sales, about inventory, prices paid. They mush all those numbers together. Mush is a technical term economists use when they're trying to put data together. So we mush the data together. And you can look at that. It pretty much tracks what we understand has gone on in Houston's economy in the past. You look to that far left-hand side, that's the Great Recession. You go over there to just to right of the middle, that's the fracking bust when we saw oil prices and the rig count drop the last time. That little dip, that's Hurricane Harvey. And then you can go to that far side and you go see how far down that goes. The PMI should be at 50 if we were neutral, or above 50 we're expanding. The PMI is actually at 34 right now. It's 34 in April. That's the lowest point on record. You have to go all the way back to March of 2009 when the PMI was 39 to find something comparable. Basically what this is showing us is that Houston's economy is in the steepest contraction that it has been in since the oil bust of the 80s. This one may be a little lighthearted, but maybe it's also illustrative. The PMI slide shows you how we kind of shut down the business side. This gives you some insight as what's going on to the consumer side. I mean, these are Houston mixed beverage receipts. This is how many mixed drinks were sold in the city of Houston each one of those months. You can see February was a pretty good month for us. Think of Mardi Gras, think of the beginning of the rodeo. We sold close to $100 million worth of Mai Tais and gin and tonics and Long Island iced tea out there. Then you can see it drop down, and then April we sold less than 13,000. It's a sign of just how much we shut down the bars and how much we shut down the restaurants and just how much social distancing was taking place. Let's go to the next slide though. Coronavirus. All 50 states moved towards reopening, so we are starting to reopen. We started to reopen in the state of Texas May 1st, and we're gradually reopening. Restaurants have gone from 25 to 50%. We're starting to see some stores open up again. A few people coming back to the offices. But reopening is very slowly. This is an example. This is kind of a proxy for where we are with reopening. You're looking at the city of Houston downtown parking transactions. Downtown is one of the biggest business centers. We have multiple business centers around town. We've got them in the Energy Corridor. We've got them out in the Galleria. Got them in the Woodlands. But you would expect of more people returning to the office that parking downtown would be going up. And can you see it's just barely ticking up. So we're really not seeing the growth or the reopening quite to the extent that we thought we'd see. We see a slight nudge up, but we're really not reopening very strongly as we wished we would see. This is another one on reopening. This is restaurant reservations, and this is something Open Table does. And they're looking at the number of reservations that people have made through their app this week versus the exact same week a year ago. And you can see, if you look on the left-hand side, that's not that interesting. But if you look at that long, flat line, it basically shows you over that period of time, no one was making reservations because no one was going to the restaurant. And you do start to see this gradually easing up on the right-hand side, but you can look at the gap from where we are on the far right-hand side to where we were before we went into the downturn. You see the restaurants are still struggling. There's a gradual reopening, but not to the level that we wish there was. So that's kind of a summary of where we are globally, summary of where we are with the U.S., part of what we see going on in Houston. So how's this going to impact Houston's global business? I mean, how's what we see going on with COVID overseas and in the U.S. going to impact our ability to do business here? Well, before we get started, let's kind of take an inventory of Houston's global assets. Let's kind of figure out just why is it important that we're concerned about what goes on through the rest of the world. You know, we're Houstonians, we're Texans, we live in the U.S. Why should people in Houston worry about what's going on globally? Well, Houston is very closely tied to the global economy. If you look at the three drivers of growth, one is energy, one is the U.S. economy, and then one is the global economy. And when energy struggles, we really depend upon the U.S. and the global economy. Right now, all three are struggling. So, give you some idea of how important it is. Metro exports this region, Houston metropolitan area, the 9 counties. Now, we exported in 2018 $120 billion worth of goods and merchandise. In 2018, that's the most current data that we have. We'll be getting 2019 soon, I hope. But it gives you some idea of just what's going on, how important how important trade is, and you can see that our trade has nearly doubled in the last 10 years. If you look at top exporting metros, you can see where we are compared to the other metros. These are the top 5. You can see Houston is very far ahead of New York and LA, and for those of you who are kind of keeping score at home, let me see if you can figure out which Texas cities aren't on this list of the top exporting metros. Now, which ones don't even have a third of the amount of exports that Houston has. If you want to look at customs district, the metro exports, that stuff we make here, it could go out any port. We might make it here, it might go out through San Francisco, it might go out through Miami, it might go out to New York. This is kind of another metric to give you some idea of how important international trade is to Houston. This is the weight, the mass, the volume of stuff we handle, not the value of stuff that we handle. And this one goes out not just through Houston, but it goes out through Galveston, it goes out through Texas City, it goes out through Freeport, it goes out through Intercontinental Airport. You see 320 million metric tons of stuff was handled across the wharves and the docks here in the metropolitan area last year, way ahead of even second place New Orleans. So kind of look at that. We've got 183 trading partners, and there are 45 countries where we do $1 billion or more in bilateral trade. So we're definitely very much interconnected to the world, and the world's interconnected to Houston. If you want to look at our top trading partners, you can see them right there. You can see Mexico, you can see Brazil and China and South Korea, the Netherlands, India, Germany, the UK, Japan and Colombia. Some idea of just how important these countries are to us. And the commodities, there's oil and refined products, chemicals, plastics, iron and steel, agricultural products, industrial equipment. I mean, I could have put the numbers up there. After a while, numbers get a little weighty. You guys will have access to a report that's going to have all this stuff in it. Those of you who are listening to this, it'll be emailed out to you later on today. So, international snapshot. I mean, 11,000 exporters, 1,700 foreign firms. You know, if we were meeting in a hotel like we normally do this and sitting around a table, this would be one of those little tents that you see on the table, one of those little prop-ups that says kind of, and the economics jargon, we often refer to these as the gee whiz stats. The gee whiz, I didn't know that we had 11,000 exporters, or wow, we have 91 countries with official government offices here. So now once more, it just shows you how important, how closely we are tied to that global economy. So, okay, COVID-19, the pandemic, been dealing with it in the U.S. since January. Actually, some may be dealing since December. We finally got all the data together. So what impact is this going to have on Houston's ability to do business overseas? Well, it's definitely going to slow growth down for the next 2 to 3 years. We're going to have weaker demand for Houston exports, limited access to our markets overseas, fewer foreign visitors are going to be able to come to Houston, and we're going to see a reduction in foreign direct investment as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the efforts to try to recover from it. So let's talk about export demand. Forbes Headline, Global Trade Outlook plunges, lowest in a decade, reports the World Trade Organization. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but that was actually published last year. That was published before we started dealing with COVID-19. We've had a problem with global trade slowing down for a while. Part of it is this response to globalism. Part of it is the trade wars that we've had. You can look at it. The World Trade Organization did some analysis. You see it there on the screen, and you can look and see that it looks like more and more, rather than having free trade, we're starting to place restrictions on trade. 2018, they identified 1,463 different restrictions or tariffs or codes or something that would inhibit the ability for one country to bring in imports from another country. And that represents 7.5% of all exports in the world. And you can look at the trajectory of that line. You can look at those bars. We've been moving away from free trade and more towards less free trade, more towards inhibiting trade. So that's one factor that was already in place that was starting to inhibit Houston's ability to sell overseas. The headlines, maybe you've seen them, the U.S.-China trade war. Think about that. This time last year, we were worried about the U.S.-China trade war escalating. And this time last year, we were working real hard to try to get a deal to replace NAFTA, the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Gosh, just think of how much things have changed, what our worries were a year ago to where they are now. If you don't think that having a trade war, putting restrictions on trade impacts Houston, you can see it right there. You can see how much our trade with China dropped off last year, dropped off over 40%. You're worried about the confusion over NAFTA and whether we're going to have an agreement to replace NAFTA. You can see what it did to Mexico trade. You know, China and Mexico are our number one and number two trading partners, but just the confusion that we've had dealing with business with China dropped China from being number two to number three. Brazil's rose up to number three. So this is IMF chief, the International Monetary Fund chief, warns full global economic recovery unlikely to 2021. You know, that's important if you think about it, because if you've got, as we saw in the earlier slides, if 200 million people aren't working, they're not going to be buying as much. They can't afford to buy as much. They're not going to have the wherewithal. If the consumer demand isn't there, if businesses aren't going to be purchasing, you're going to definitely see trade slow down until we start to see some significant recovery in the global economy. And until we see significant recovery in the global economy, it's going to put pressure on Houston's exports. Now, the chart I'm showing on the screen right there, you can look at it. That purple line is year-over-year change in GDP. That's year-over-year change in global GDP. That broken kind of brownish or orangish line that you're looking at, that's change in global exports. And you can look and see, maybe the order of magnitude isn't the same, but they definitely overlay. Whenever you see a drop in global growth, you're seeing a drop in exports. Whenever you see an increase in global growth, you're seeing an increase in exports. Maybe it's a chicken or egg thing, but what it says is that until we start to see growth return to the rest of the world, we're not going to see demand for exports, and that's going to weigh on that part of Houston's economy. Let's talk about international air service. Let's talk about the ability to get in and out of Houston from Brazil or from Berlin or from Beijing. If you look at, just once again, kind of gee whiz facts, kind of imagine you're one of those pilots in the cockpit and you're going, okay, let's go through the checklist. 2 airports, check. Carriers offering service, 23, check. International destinations, check. Kind of gives you an idea of just how important the international air service is here in Houston. Think about it, we have 851 international flights per week. You know, we fly to every continent but Antarctica, and maybe at some point we'll be flying there as well. If you want to look at how we rank among the airports, you can see that as far as the number of international flights that we have, we rank 5th in the U.S. Now, you've got your West Coast, your East Coast, and in the South, Houston is the one that leads all the other places in the number of international flights. So there's an interview that was done that David Calhoun, CEO of Boeing, did on the Today program about a week ago. And he said it'll take 3 to 5 years for the airline industry to return from the apocalyptic state. Now, he got grief from the airlines for saying that. He also got grief from the airlines because he said that he thought one of the majors will probably go bankrupt or merge. But think about it. Boeing's job is selling airplanes. They're selling airplanes to their customers, and they're looking out there and they don't see the international travel returning for quite some time. So you can look at it right here. This is TSA, Checkpoint Travel Data, Transportation Safety Administration. And this is for the entire U.S. Now you look at that, and that's the number of people the TSA were checking through this time last year. And look at the blue line on the bottom. Gives you just some indication of just how far international air travel, or just travel in general, has fallen. Whether it's domestic or international, it's down significantly. So the International Air Transportation Association, IATA, you see the little logo on the lower right-hand side, they did a survey, and in the survey they found that 86% of the people who responded to the survey said they're concerned about quarantine while traveling. And 69% said they would reconsider travel if it meant that they might have a 14-day quarantine. And face it, there are a lot of countries that have simply closed their borders and are not allowing people to fly into those countries. And when they get to the country, they're going to have to go through all sorts of screening. And when they get there, if they have a high temperature or if they don't pass the screening, they may be quarantined for 2 weeks, whether it's flying into a country in Europe or Africa or flying into the US. And so that's going to hold down international travel. Now, there are some possible solutions out there, things that are being knocked around in the airline industry. This little bubble to put over your seat, that way there's also the fear factor that we're dealing with flying. Those of you who remember Get Smart, this reminds me a little bit of the cone of silence. Or this one where you do away with the center seat altogether. That's not a bad idea, and putting up a plastic divider. Or how about this one where people are facing back and forth with that plastic divider? And when I looked at this, the first thing I saw was, gosh, look at all that leg room. Maybe that is one way to get people flying again, is to give them some leg room. But let's get back to this IATA. They're saying domestic travel won't return to pre-COVID levels until 2022. And they're saying international traffic volumes won't return until 2024. That's 5 years away. That's what IATA is saying. It kind of aligns with what Boeing's saying. So think about it. This is an international city. And if we can't bring people in and out of this international city, it's going to affect our ability to do business. It's going to reduce our global reach. It's going to make it more difficult for us to fly overseas and recruit new clients or line up new business. I mean, we always like to stay in touch with our existing clients. It's going to be difficult to fly overseas to stay in touch with existing clients. I mean, if you're trying to recruit from overseas, think of all the engineers in town, or all the doctors, or the programmers, or the artists, or the restaurateurs, all the people that you know who are from overseas that make this such a great city, that are contributing to the economic growth. It'll be difficult for them to come here. It'll slow tech transfer. It's going to reduce tourism. It's going to weaken global supply chains. We think about passenger traffic and the luggage on a plane, but probably half of the space underneath an airplane that's not occupied with luggage is occupied with some sort of cargo. It may be computer chips. It may be flowers. It could be equipment. But the lack of international air service, or the inhibition or the slowing down of international travel, will affect the economy. And it's going to affect foreign direct investment. It's going to affect the ability for companies to come here and decide, do they want to invest in Houston? Because at some point they've got to kick the tires. You can't simply, you can buy shoes online. I mean, you can buy clothes online. I bought a backpack online the other day, but you can't make a decision to open up a $100 million chemical plant just by going on the internet. You have to come here. You have to look at the property. You have to talk to the people here. So let's talk a little bit about foreign direct investment. And foreign direct investment is going to be impacted, one, by the inability for foreign investors to come here, not just to open up a chemical plant or a manufacturing facility, but also to buy real estate, to own office buildings, to be part of the economy. Foreign direct investment is so important to this region. If you go back to 2009, we have something called a new business announcements database that we run here at the partnership. We try to keep track of everybody who's announced they're coming here, both domestic and international. And since 2009, we've had 669 company announcements of someone's opening up or expanding. The easy ones to know are people like IKEA that have come here, or the Bank of China, or so forth. But also other smaller firms that have come here. 439 different foreign-owned firms have made announcements over the last 10, 11 years that they're coming to Houston. 63 different industries. That represents almost $36 billion invested in this region. Get some idea who those companies are. You can see the logos on the screen. A lot of those, IKEA, like I said, or DHL, you might not know Lonza, they're a pharmaceutical company. But foreign direct investment is so important for the continued growth of this economy. For one thing, it infuses new capital to the region. I just said $36 billion over the last 10, 11 years. It expands the manufacturing base. Think of all the chemical plants and other facilities that have expanded along the Houston Ship Channel since 2014. A lot of those are foreign-owned, or it's a domestic company that's in a joint venture with a foreign-owned firm. It helps to underpin jobs. These companies come here and they open up a factory and they pay their employees. It facilitates the change of ideas and best practices. If a foreign-owned firm opens up an operation in Houston, they're going to be bringing their technology to Houston. It increases trade, stimulates growth, and it adds to the tax base. Anytime someone opens up a new plant, a new facility, it goes on the tax rolls at HCAD or the Fort Bend County Appraisal District, and these companies pay taxes, which then goes to paying the general needs of the community. So foreign investment falls to near decade low as globalization slows. Think about that. That was in January that we were already starting to see foreign direct investment fall. And part of that was response to the globalization. Part of it is, and I could have done a whole nother presentation on that, and actually in an earlier outline, I had a whole section on globalization. I was realizing this was going on too long, but there's a sense that maybe free trade isn't the best thing in the world. There's a sense that maybe we need to hold some industries back. Maybe some people are thinking that we need to rethink globalization. That's one of the reasons why we're starting to see the slowdown in foreign direct investment. You can see it at World Economic Forum. They're seeing the foreign investment drying up thanks to COVID-19, and the United Nations did a study, and they think our global investment could fall by 40% this year. Think about it. If a company is worried about their future, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to do whatever they can to conserve cash flow. They may be shutting down operations. They may be laying people off. They're definitely not taking on debt. If their business is not expanding, they're not going to be making new investments. And if they make new investments, they're probably more likely to make it home rather than make it in a foreign country. So what you're looking at right there, this is foreign direct investment in the U.S. The data of this level of detail is not available for Houston, but I'm pretty much mirrors what we expect to see going on in Houston. You can look back and see what's going back all the way back to the 90s, those gray shaded areas. Those are recessions, U.S. recessions, and global recessions actually as well. And then you can look at that blue line, and you look at that blue line, the way it traces through those gray bars, and you can see once the economy starts to slow down, foreign direct investment slows down. So we're going to see a lot less foreign direct investment in Houston until we start to see some more global growth. And now, oil and gas. I can sum this up in just about 4 slides. Okay, this is data that was pulled on the morning of May 22nd. It's from Yahoo. It looks at futures prices. If you believe futures are, the market is one of the best determination of what's going to happen with prices, and not some forecaster, you can see the market is thinking that crude prices won't be much above $35 a barrel a year from now. You can go all the way to November, and they're still going to be below $40 a barrel. And that's important because at that price, it covers the cost of producing existing oil, but it's not high enough to go and explore for new oil. To look for new oil, we really need crude prices to be $50 or $60. And so this is going to show up in exploration activity and permitting down the road. If you look at there, you can look at the rig count right there. You can see how much the rig count has fallen. We were at the height of the fracking boom in the early part of the decade. We had 1,931 rigs working. Now we're barely above 400. We actually have fewer rigs working now than we had during the fracking bust of 15 and 16. When you see so few rigs working in the U.S., that's a sign that production is going to be falling off. It's a sign that there are going to be layoffs. I mean, if you have a fifth of the number of rigs working that you once did, you're going to need a lot fewer employees. And so we are starting to see the layoffs. You're seeing all these companies that you see on the screen have announced layoffs in the last 6 weeks. I really suspect there have been a lot more layoffs taking place out there, but a lot of them are being done quietly. But it gets to, how many layoffs have we seen? Just since COVID started, we've seen 13,000 jobs lost in the energy sector in Houston. But this has been going on for a while. This has actually started over a year ago. And we've actually got 21,000 fewer people working in oil and gas in Houston than did a year ago. I know that was a very abbreviated explanation of what's going on with energy. There's so many other things I could be talking about. Shut-in wells, the feud between Russia and Saudi Arabia, the impact that we're seeing telecommuting having on gasoline consumption, the lack of travel. I really need much more time to talk about what's going on with energy. That's the reason why on June 23rd, we're going to have another virtual event where we'll be talking about what goes on with energy and how it's going to affect Houston. And you can sign up for that at houston.org/events. So let's get to the conclusion. What's the impact that COVID-19 is going to have on Houston's economy? Just got to summarize it again. Slower growth over the next 2 to 3 years. There's going to be weaker demand for Houston's exports. We're going to have limited access to markets overseas until we start seeing more international travel, until countries overseas allow us to enter their countries. There's still a lot of countries that are simply shut to foreign travel. We'll see fewer visitors here, and we're definitely going to see a reduction in foreign direct investment. So, what's the outlook look like? How soon will we rebound? Well, if you look at there, Larry Kudlow, President Trump's chief advisor, thinks that maybe after a difficult May, we'll start to see some significant growth in the second half of this year. But you go to Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, and he's saying that the recovery could drag on through 2021, another 18 months. And then Barron's is even reporting that it could take as long as 3 years for the global economy to recover if everything goes right. So really, where does that leave us? Maybe we should just pay attention to what George Soros said. He said, we will not go back to where we were when the pandemic started. That's pretty certain, but that is the only thing that is certain. Once again, I'm glad that you guys tuned in for this virtual event. Hopefully you've got some information which will help you to understand what's going on with the global economy and Houston's economy and how COVID-19 is going to affect Houston. And you can factor that into some of the business decisions you're going to have to make over the next few months. So with that, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick, for that very informative presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker who will join me for a virtual fireside chat discussion. Carlos Gutierrez is chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, a premier global strategy and commercial diplomacy firm. He served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce from 2005 to 2009 under President George W. Bush, where he worked with foreign government and business leaders to advance economic relationships, enhance trade, and promote U.S. exports. Secretary Gutierrez also played a key role in the passage of landmark free trade agreements that remove trade barriers, expand export opportunities, and boost global investment. Previously, Secretary Gutierrez spent nearly 30 years with Kellogg Company, the global manufacturer and marketer of well-known food brands. After assignments in Latin America, Canada, Asia, and the United States, he became president and CEO of Kellogg in 1999, the youngest CEO in the company's 100-year history. Secretary Gutierrez joined Albright Stonebridge from Citi, where he was vice chairman of the Institutional Clients Group and a member of the Senior Strategic Advisory Group. He currently serves as the chair of the National Foreign Trade Council and of the U.S. Chamber's U.S.-Cuba Business Council. He also serves on the boards of the U.S. Chamber's U.S.-India Business Council and the Boao Forum for Asia, sometimes referred to as the Davos of Asia. He also serves on the boards of Occidental Petroleum Corporation right here in Houston, MetLife, PwC, Veritas Learning, the George W. Bush Institute's Human Freedom Advisory Council, and Republicans for Immigration Reform. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start the conversation by going back in time and thinking about the situation before the outbreak, before the announcement of a pandemic back in March. Can you recall what was the outlook for the global economy back in the fourth quarter of last year and coming into this year?
Actually, it was strong, no question about it. And the U.S. economy was really a bright spot in the global economy, but growth rates were beginning to decline. So our GDP estimate for the year was 1.9%, a lot lower than what we had before. So the pandemic hit us at a time when our economy was beginning to slow, but there's no question it was a strong world economy. The U.S. was the bright spot, and our unemployment was low, and we were in great shape.
So let me ask you to do what must be particularly difficult at this moment is now to look ahead. So you take that reasonably rosy view, but not quite as rosy perhaps as it had been the year or two prior, but still a pretty good outlook for the future. We go through this experience. Now we're looking ahead. How do you see the economy in the latter half of this year and on into 21? How has that world changed?
Well, it's interesting, the question. You said we get through this and we go ahead, and there are several ways that we get through this, but I think the economy will be soft for the foreseeable future. I don't see a dramatic rebound. 36 million people out of work, even though businesses have opened. That doesn't mean that consumers are ready to go back to those businesses. And that's what we're seeing now. People talk about when we open the economy is opening. This is what it looks like. This is what the opening looks like. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It will be gradual. It will be incremental. So it will take a while to get all those people back in the workforce, to get businesses growing at the capacity that they were. So yes, late 21, I think we'll begin to see better growth. We will have to, at that point, deal with our fiscal situation, our fiscal deficit, which as a percent of GDP will be the highest we've had since World War II. So that could mean that we may have to print money. Interest rates will most likely increase. And as the velocity of that money increases, we'll probably see some inflation. But tackling that deficit will be the main challenge, the main economic challenge coming out of this.
Well, let me take you back again to an issue that preceded the pandemic. And that was that global trade was seeming to fall out of favor with the public in a way that, frankly, I hadn't seen in my lifetime, my career. And that wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon. It seemed to be happening around the world. That assumption that we were going to move towards a more and more globally integrated economy, free trade, supply chains that extended around the world, that was falling into question before the pandemic. And there seemed to be an emerging hostility towards the whole idea. Well, did you see that same thing? Let me first confirm that you saw some of that happening. And then I'd be curious, to what do we attribute that change in broad public sentiment?
Well, I think we'd have to go back a ways. NAFTA was, one of those turning points. It was really the beginning of the U.S. entering into trade in an aggressive way. There was a lot of skepticism about NAFTA. Congress approved it. And I remember when I came into government, 2005, back then there was some skepticism about trade. The president in 2001 received fast track approval to be able to move agreements through with an up or down vote, but that came by 1 vote. He won that by 1 vote. In 2005, we had the Central America Free Trade Agreement approved, which was, the business case for it was very logical, very, very practical. They were charging us tariffs, we weren't, so this leveled the playing field. We also got that through by 1 vote. Back then, it was very partisan. Democrats were not in favor. Most Republicans were, but you could see the reactions. And what we were seeing is on a local level, communities were reacting. Communities who had lost manufacturing facilities to other countries were reacting. And if you look at the macro numbers, it would suggest that trade is good. Trade is helping the economy. But then you have to go into individual communities who are constituents of members of Congress, of the House, of the Senate. And that's where you began to see issues. So when President Obama was not focused on trade in his first term, it wasn't one of the top 10 priorities. And I think he was reading also what was out there. And when President Trump came in, he found fertile ground for a protectionist policy, for a protectionist platform, and the willingness of voters to listen to an anti-trade argument was very strong. The conditions had been set. So it's been a gradual movement. And as they say, we're not seeing any new trends, but we are seeing the acceleration of previous trends. And this is one, and it's happening all over the world. Countries are talking about self-reliance, self-sufficiency, cutting off on exports, and it is turning into a global trend, and I think we will see this for quite a while.
Well, when you think about angst associated with trade, you have to talk about China. China has become a major trading partner of the U.S. and the entire world. For Houston, it's either our number one or number two trading partner each year. Right now, it's number two after Mexico. Why is it, do you think, that so much of this angst was directed specifically at China? Was it something they did or something they were doing or something about the way the public perceived them or some combination of all that?
Well, again, we'd have to go back a little bit in history because this is an acceleration of a trend that we were seeing. When China joined the WTO, they began exporting to the U.S. and began exporting in a very aggressive way. Textile manufacturers all of a sudden were faced with an increase in imports of hundreds of percentage points. And all of a sudden we realized, boy, this Chinese juggernaut is taking away jobs. And then manufacturing facilities started moving to China. The perception was still favorable that it's better to have China engaged, China involved, than China isolated. As time went by, we started having some intellectual property rights issues, and those increased. Our trade deficit with China also increased. So again, the conditions were ripe for someone, a presidential candidate, to come in like President Trump did and say, hey, China is ripping us off and China's taking jobs, and our trade deficit is so large with China that they're getting the better part of us. And that, people were very, very willing to listen to that. I should say that from a desire to reduce our trade deficit with China, when we started increasing tariffs, that also seems like such a long time ago because we have evolved. And we've evolved to a point where now it is official U.S. policy to decouple from China. And that's what we have been doing. And just about every day or every week, we see signs of that decoupling. We heard yesterday or the day before about a Commerce Department regulation, which is coming out on September 14th. It will be valid. It will be in place where companies who sell to Huawei have to get a license from the Commerce Department. Huawei, of course, is one of China's largest companies. It's a very proud part of the China brand. And this regulation can debilitate Huawei in a very significant way. There aren't other suppliers who can offset U.S. supplies. So that is something that we had considered the nuclear option. That's already happened. We have also put restrictions on pension investments going into Chinese indices. We are beginning to make it very difficult for Chinese companies to list in our stock exchanges. Our student exchanges have declined substantially. Chinese foreign investment in the U.S. has declined by 90%. So it's happening. We are beginning to rely less on China. We are decoupling from China. And that is a very, very big shift. And we'll have to see how our allies behave will be very important, whether they follow us or whether they use this as an opportunity to gain market share in China or to gain favor with China. And that will be something to watch. But yes, in the presidential elections, no one will run on a pro-China platform. You can be sure of that. And both candidates will be vying to see who has the position of tougher on China.
That has all kind of implications for Houston. As I mentioned, they're our number 2 trade partner. Our exports to China were growing considerably more rapidly than our imports from China. We could actually see a point where Houston would have a positive trade balance with China 2 or 3 years from now. We were on that trajectory, driven in some measure by the energy trade, the LNG trade specifically, which was just beginning to emerge, as well as petrochemicals that we're beginning to produce here for export. So that was all fairly certain at the time that was going to happen. And then we had that China free trade agreement just in January. I mean, that was at least a momentary pause in hostility. Does that January agreement even have standing at the moment, or did we just rush right past that point?
Yeah, I don't see that right now. The relationship is it is so antagonistic that to go back, the phase 1 agreement essentially had China buying up to $200 billion of U.S. goods between manufacturing and agriculture primarily. That's not happening. It's not happening, one, because of the Chinese economy, but also, again, the relationship. There isn't enough goodwill there to have the Chinese buy more than they need, which is essentially what they need to do to deliver on that agreement. The other part of it was intellectual property rights protections and some structural reforms. China's continuing to move forward with some of those reforms, opening up the financial sector. But I believe they probably would have done that anyway, and it's for China's benefit. But I think it'll be tough to have the agreement come through from the purchasing standpoint for those $200 billion to actually be purchased by China.
Well, again, that's a concern. So some of those exports would have come from the area. Let me, again, expand the lens back to the U.S. in competing in a global trade system. We'd actually been seeing some positive trends in our trade balance beginning at the end of 2018. So we saw improvement through 2019. We actually had the lowest trade deficit in recent times in February of this year, but that was probably driven in part by what was already happening in China relative to the virus. But you could at least look at the 19 data and say the U.S. Competitive situation was improving modestly. How do you see the U.S. competing in a competitive global economy today? I mean, is the U.S. well positioned at the end of the day, or do we have some strengths, or is this going to be a kind of a steady battle of kind of losing and giving up ground?
Well, that is a great question, because if you go back, our trade deficit usually increases when we're growing, because it means we're consuming more. And in times of recession, for example, during the Great Recession, we saw our deficit decline. Why? Because we were buying less, because our economy was stagnant. So our model, our macroeconomic model, relies on lower price inputs and higher value outputs. And that's what's made us so competitive. We're going to have to remain competitive in an environment where much of that manufacturing will return, which means we may see prices go up. And that will be something that we'll have to manage. Now, there is the benefit of productivity as a result of technology, which we'll be seeing, and that will be a benefit to the U.S. economy. In the short term, the trade deficit with China has declined, but the overall trade deficit is not. And what that means is that goods manufactured in China have moved to other places, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, other countries, Mexico. So we're going through a change in business model, in macroeconomic model, where we rely more on ourselves, where we manufacture more, and that will require a different way of achieving competitiveness. And I believe that our best opportunity is technology, is through productivity.
You mentioned Mexico just then, and I want to shift to Mexico. I mentioned they're the Houston #1 trade partner. Most Houston business people were not asking for NAFTA reform, frankly, going back a few years. And therefore, when everything got put at risk around that whole debate over NAFTA, we were quite concerned. Therefore, we were quite relieved with USMCA and the fact that it was signed, and now we're moving forward. And we would acknowledge, I think, Houston business, that USMCA is probably better than the original NAFTA. So now we're moving forward. How do you see the U.S., Mexico, and we should say U.S., Mexico, and Canada, even though we in Houston don't trade as much with Canada, how do you see that whole world now evolving now that we have USMCA nailed down?
Well, I agree. I'm glad we have it nailed down. I'm glad it's behind us. And some people will nitpick part of it. For example, the automobile standards are a little bit rough. They're harder to achieve, a bit more complex. The rules of origin, the amount of an automobile that needs to be built with certain wages per hour that don't exist in Mexico. So companies are having a hard time adjusting to that. The other problem we're seeing is that what Mexico considers essential businesses aren't necessarily synchronized with what we consider essential businesses. So they will say automobiles are an essential business. That's great. But some suppliers are not viewed as essential. So that is a problem that we have to fix today. Synchronizing, having more communication, working more bilaterally to ensure that supply chains are in sync. Today they are not, and Mexican exports, automobile exports, are down substantially. There are other issues that are beginning to surface that could impact USMCA. There is some chatter about the U.S. potentially stopping imports of beef because of our own situation, where we are, we're slaughtering beef. We're not sending it to the market, in part because of restaurants closing down, also because of, again, the supply chain not being in balance, labor shortages in certain places. If that happens, that would essentially unvalidate USMCA. So because of COVID, it's very fragile. And we have two different politics on each side. And right now is probably the most fragile period. And we're not seeing the benefits that we will eventually see from USMCA.
That worries me. For a couple of decades there, we had just grown so accustomed with the open border with Mexico, an integrated economy with Mexico, and under President Peña Nieto, even the liberalization of the energy markets. So we here in Houston had extraordinary optimism about the outlook for Houston-Mexico trade. Now under the current administration, we all say AMLO, there is more underlying question about the direction of Mexico's politics. And then you add the components here in the U.S., where we're not treating the agreement as necessarily a firm commitment either. It certainly makes it hard for business people to think about the next phase of their development of an integrated supply chain with Mexico.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you mentioned AMLO. He has proven to be more left than people had imagined. Although some of us remembered him from previous campaigns, and he's very much of a nationalist. So right now, the business community in Mexico is extremely nervous about AMLO. Some of the decisions he made early on, the cancellation of the airport was really put some fear into the private sector. Some of the energy contracts that have been canceled as well. So the environment isn't conducive to capital investments, and we've seen those drop off. So all of those things, and then COVID, of course, that all of those things are combining so that we're not really taking advantage of USMCA. And I don't think it will really come to life until we get through some of these issues and really align political philosophies on both sides of the border.
You know, you mentioned President AMLO he's really governing as his entire political history would suggest he would have governed. He simply ran on a different platform and therefore gave some hope that he would not kind of revert back to style. And now he's reverted back to style. And that's hence the issue, hence the question.
Yeah, that's very true. He ran as a pragmatist, and people say, well, he's going to be a pragmatist. He'll take care of deficits. He will promote free trade. He will keep the energy reform in place. He will promote foreign and direct investment. And it really hasn't happened. There really isn't an economic doctrine or an economic policy. He essentially is managing through a series of projects. So right now, his big project is to build a refinery in the Southeast. You have to wonder if it's really worth the billions of dollars that will cost. A bullet train in the Southeast, and you have to wonder if that's really where you want to put infrastructure. So that lack of an economic policy is also making it more blurry, more confusing as to where he's actually taking the country.
So you're now a strategy consultant. So I can ask you this question because I know you've given it some thought. So how should business be thinking about the global trade environment? How do you see American business specifically kind of taking advantage of or reacting to this changed world that we've been talking about for the last few minutes?
Yeah, we believe that businesses need to be more engaged in public policy. We actually recommend to businesses that they should have their own foreign policy, because in many ways, our foreign policy has always been in line with the business community. And if we've had problems, then we go to our government, and we're all in sync. With the focus on trade deficits, with the problems with China, that's being caught in the middle. So China may retaliate to our moves against Huawei by putting some U.S. companies on an unreliable list. And those could be companies that can no longer sell to Huawei because they're prohibited from doing so. So they're caught in the middle, and that's why companies need to be a lot more engaged. CEOs need to think of themselves not just as leaders and managers of a business, but also as sort of secretaries of state of their corporations. And they need to be out there with key business allies, with key government officials, and making the case for their company and the role that their company plays in that local economy. But right now, they're sort of getting stuck in a lot of these geopolitical battles.
You know, we find the same thing to be true here at the partnership. Whenever something happens in Washington, we have to reach out to our contacts in China and basically tell them our stance on the issue, and in some manner encourage them that we're going to continue to want to do business with this noise notwithstanding. And that's at the government level and the level of individual companies. We can't, just as you said, we can't rely on that communication through DC to really take our message of wanting to continue to do business forward.
Right. And as countries look inward, it's becoming less of a global government affairs strategy or even regional. Within regions, you'll find different policies in different countries. So the whole outreach to governments and the policy towards governments will have to expand and will have to intensify.
You know, at the very beginning, you were talking about the nature of the recovery from the COVID situation. You were in the administration during the Great Recession. And then, again, it seems so long ago now in some respects. And people really forget the degree of crisis that there was, particularly early on when you were still in charge there, you in the Bush administration. Could you create some parallels and some contrasts between what you were managing through in the Great Recession and what this recovery is going to be like? What's going to be similar? What's going to be different as you compare and contrast those two?
I would say the similarity is that there was a lot of fear. There is fear today about the economy and the virus. And back then, there were some days of some very uncomfortable nights for a lot of people. What we called it money market funds were so-called breaking the buck, which would mean that they would essentially not be paid. They would go into default. That would have been a crisis. That was averted. The Lehman Brothers situation was also something that really shook international markets. But to compare the two, the stimulus for during the Great Recession was about 600 and change. Let's just say $600 billion. Today, we're now thinking of going to 6 trillion. So the magnitude of the impact and the magnitude of the solution is just so much greater than it was back then. And I do want to say something. I don't want to plug anyone politically, but I'll tell you, one of the things that I thought about very often is I am so glad that it was President George Bush who was in office when that came to pass. We were talking about how trends don't just happen, they build. A lot of what happened with real estate, this real estate mortgages just being wrapped up into these credit instruments were as a result of policy. Since the 1990s, we had a community development policy, which meant that we wanted home ownership to grow. So what was happening was real estate agents were making sure that home ownership grew. Lending standards were declining since the 90s. And I remember, anecdotally meeting some people who made $40,000 a year, but just bought an $800,000 home. Why? Because it was just a matter of getting the paper. The standards for applying the credit weren't too high, and then they would just be sold out into the marketplace. So I just wanted to clarify that because it wasn't directly impacted by Bush administration policies. It was something that he had to deal with that was evolving over time, and it really hit a peak. Home ownership hit a peak during the Bush administration. But that was a scary time. I think today we're talking about a different magnitude, and we're talking about two aspects: the economic aspect, where the economy is shut down, and then, of course, the health aspect, which also creates fear.
Yeah, there's so many ways to contrast the two. But as you said, the Great Recession, the forces at work built over a long period of time. And then when the crisis hit, the crisis was a day-to-day crisis. I mean, literally, the headline of every day was different than the headline of the previous day. I mean, it was moving that quickly. And the actions you and the administration were taking had to deal with issues at that pace. Today's issue, as you said, money market accounts, what do you have to do to support that? This issue come on fairly quickly, in a sense. I mean, we weren't talking about the coronavirus until late last year at the earliest, and probably weren't talking about it too much even then. But now we have this long-term policy environment to re-stimulate the economy. And as you said, it's denominated in trillions, not billions. What would you point to today, though, as policy that the government should be considering to support this recovery? And I'd say maybe just beyond the short-term stimulus which has been applied to date. What else would you suggest that government be doing at this moment to improve the outlook for the U.S. economy?
Well, one of the things that we've seen with this crisis is the advent of technology, the increase of the use of technology. And again, that's not a new trend. We've known and we've been talking about how the digital economy will change technology and how we work, but we weren't really seeing it. We were seeing it in baby steps. It was very gradual. This crisis has really made it a step change. We have now seen the arrival of that new digital economy at scale, and that will hurt employment. That will put some workers out of a job, and we need to be thinking about retraining. We need to be taking this a lot more seriously, whether it be national retraining programs. I think the private sector can play a bigger role in ensuring that displaced workers have the skills they need to be able to move into other jobs. But that's something down the road. On one hand, it's a big advantage that we are so innovative, and we are by far the leader in technology innovation. The downside to that, of course, is that it will impact the future of work. It will impact how we work, and therefore we have to prepare our workers for that new economy. We just can't leave them behind. We need them all.
We spend a lot of time in Houston thinking about this evolving workplace and workforce. We have our Upskill Houston program targeted at how do we help middle skill workers transform to a more digital economy.
Right.
Like young people, frankly, into a workforce that they probably haven't given a lot of thought to in a while. There was such a push to complete a four-year degree. But now in Houston, we have the digital economy transition displacing workers. We have the oil price decline, which we haven't spent time on today, and we have COVID. So it's a tough time. It's a period of transition, bar none, right? But, who would have?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even what we're doing right now, we're on this Zoom meeting. At the beginning, say 2 months ago, I think we looked at this technology as being a substitute, a poor substitute for in-person meetings. I think when we all go back to the office, when that day comes, we're going to continue using this technology. And the technology will continue to improve. And we've all gotten used to, one way or the other, using technologies that we had not used before. People are ordering more from home because they don't want to go to the grocery store. There's a big chance that they will continue to do that after COVID. And there are many instances of technology just really making its way into society that we had not seen before. So that will have a big impact. And you mentioned diplomas and reskilling. I think this is a time when the diploma, the general education system that we have will need to change. It's not going to be about that diploma. It's going to be about skills. And those skills will have to be upgraded. You can no longer say, well, I've got an MBA from Harvard, so I'm set for life. You have an MBA from Harvard, but in 18 months, that may not be as current as you thought it was. So training workers for skills. And that means all the way from the shop floor to the C-suite.
Carlos, your comment hits close to home with a Harvard MBA that's already 40 years old. So maybe I won't get another 40 years out of it, but I get your point.
Congratulations.
Let me conclude with going back to a large policy issue. And the discussion in the U.S. right now is reopen versus kind of manage the virus. And in some quarters, it's being framed as a do one or do the other, or today, should we be doing one or do the other? How do you think about the opportunity and the need to balance reopening with continuing to manage the progression of this virus for months and months and months?
Well, I think as we were saying, the reopening has happened. It's already taken place. We have started reopening the economy. And if you balance health and the economy, this is what it will look like. It will be very gradual. It will be hesitant in some cases. In many cases, businesses will reopen, but consumers won't be ready. The alternative is, so-called herd immunity, where we just say, look, let's just keep going and until everyone is infected, and those who survive will be immune. And by the way, that hasn't been confirmed medically, but that's essentially what happened in the 1917 pandemic. Is everyone got the flu, and some people survived, and those who survived, a lot of people survived, those who survived were immune. I don't think that the country is ready for that. I know that this has become an issue of freedom, of rights, a constitutional issue. Can you force me to wear a mask? So it's a fascinating debate, but there is a significant portion of society that does not want to go back to work while there is still some danger.
And I'm sympathetic. I mean, people do have that concern, and probably to a degree that I didn't anticipate. I mean, I see the data every day straight from our medical community. I have the ability to be more informed than most people, but the general person on the street is still very nervous about the progression of this virus coming back into the workplace. And I appreciate that. And the concerns are in some ways real. You know, our stance at the partnership is that we must manage this virus and manage it well, and we must reopen the economy. We cannot do for the next 6 months what we have done for the last 2 months, and that's tricky. And it's going to take an adroit set of leadership and behaviors from the public. I think we can do it if the public, in many respects, stays with us on this, continues to adhere to all these things we've been talking about. They don't treat reopening as a signal to go back to the behaviors pre-virus. And that's what would get us in trouble, in my view.
Right. And behaviors are changing. I mean, we're all washing our hands a lot more than we did before. We're wearing masks. We don't get closer than 6 feet to people. That behavior is helping. And to the extent that behavior grows, that will help open the economy. So I was making the parallel, and some people don't believe it's analogous, but HIV, we never found a vaccine. There is a treatment, but behavior changed. And last year, I believe the annual death toll is 13,000, which you compare that to where it was in the 80s and 90s, mid 90s when it peaked. There's no comparison. So behavior is changing, and that will help. We just need to stay on it and not lose a slight sense of fear. I was saying the other day, we all love FDR's quote that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and that was right for the times. And I think today we may have to say something like the only thing we have to fear is a total lack of fear. A certain level of fear, I think, is good, and that's what's going to keep people on the existing behavior and continuing to improve.
Well, Secretary Gutierrez, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate ending on that final point, and we'll let it end there. But thank you for the time you've given this. Thank you for your service to the public during a really critical time in U.S. history. We appreciate you then, and we appreciate you now. Thank you so much.
You're very kind, Bob. Thank you, and thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you to Houston.
Thanks.
Thank you all again for joining us today for the Partnership's first virtual State of event. As many of you know, the Partnership is known for delivering expert insight, resources, and thought leadership on issues impacting the greater Houston region, and today's event is truly indicative of that. I'd like to thank Mitsubishi Corporation Americas again for their support of the Partnership as presenting sponsor of the 2020 State of Houston's Global Economy. While we're not certain of COVID-19's long-term impacts on the economy, businesses, and communities worldwide, or what lies ahead as we begin the road to recovery, The partnership is committed to serving our 1,100 member companies and the Houston region during this time of uncertainty. We hope that you'll continue to look toward the partnership as a trusted resource and hub of vital information in the weeks and months to come. Remember that as a participant in today's event, you are provided with an exclusive first look at the partnership's 2020 Global Houston Report, which can be downloaded by clicking the link below the video screen. A copy will also be emailed to you along with a recording of today's program. Visit our website at houston.org for timely materials on COVID-19, business recovery resources, regional data of all types, and information on upcoming virtual events. Thank you for joining us today and have a great afternoon.